Hey guys! Tonight, we journey through dust and stone to walk roads that once carried the footsteps of emperors and merchants, soldiers and slaves. Roads that stretched across continents like arteries of an empire, pulsing with life, trade, and conquest. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a cobblestone road, its surface worn smooth by countless wheels and sandaled feet. The stones gleam faintly in the morning light, fitted so precisely that not even a blade of grass dares grow between them. This is no ordinary path carved by farmers or merchants seeking the quickest route between villages. This is a Roman road, and it was built to last forever. Picture yourself kneeling on those ancient stones. Your fingers trace the edges where master craftsmen fitted each piece with mathematical precision. The surface feels solid beneath your palms, unyielding, as though the very earth had been transformed into something harder than nature intended. These roads were not suggestions carved into the landscape. They were declarations, statements of power that announced to every traveler that Rome was eternal and its reach was absolute. Archaeological evidence reveals the staggering scope of Roman engineering. At the empire's height, over 250,000 miles of roads crisscross the known world, connecting Britain to the deserts of Africa, Spain to the mountains of Armenia. Each mile was surveyed, planned, and constructed with the same relentless precision that built the Colosseum and the aqueducts. Yet unlike those monuments to spectacle and survival, the roads served a purpose both practical and profound. They were the nervous system of an empire, carrying information faster than any civilization before or since. You begin walking along the ancient stones, your footsteps echoing faintly in the crisp air. The road stretches ahead, straight as an arrow, climbing hills and crossing valleys without deviation. Roman engineers did not believe in compromise. Where other builders might have curved around obstacles, the Romans carved through them. Where rivers blocked their path, they built bridges. Where mountains stood in their way, they blasted tunnels. The road was sacred and the road was straight. The construction itself was a marvel that modern engineers still study with admiration. You pause beside a section where centuries of weather have exposed the road's inner layers. Beneath the smooth stone surface lies a foundation built to outlast civilizations. First came the statumen, massive stones laid deep in the earth to form an unshakable base. Above that, the rudis, smaller stones mixed with mortar to create a level platform. Then the nucleus, finer gravel and sand compressed until it rang like metal when struck. Finally, the summum dorsum, the surface layer of perfectly fitted polygonal stones that could bear the weight of armies and endure the passage of millennia. The labor required was staggering. Roman legions, when not conquering territories, became construction crews. Soldiers who had marched across Europe with sword and shield picked up hammers and chisels to build the very roads they would march upon. Each legion left its mark in stone, creating pathways that would carry not only their own footsteps, but those of countless generations to come. The work was backbreaking, precise, and endless. Yet it was also transformative, turning wilderness into civilization 1 mile at a time. You continue walking, and the road begins to reveal its secrets. Every few miles, you encounter milestones, stone markers that announce distances to major cities in precise Roman numerals. These weren't mere guideposts, but symbols of imperial authority, reminders that every step you took was measured and recorded by the state. The stones themselves were carved with the names of emperors, their titles and achievements, proclaiming glory even to travelers who might never see Rome itself. The traffic on these roads must have been extraordinary. Your imagination fills the empty stone with the sounds of ancient commerce. Iron-shod wheels grinding against stone as ox-drawn carts hauled grain from Egypt to feed Rome's hungry masses. The rhythmic clopping of horse hooves as imperial messengers raced along the Cursus Publicus. The state postal system that could carry urgent messages from Britain to Constantinople in weeks rather than months. The measured march of legions in full battle gear, their bronze armor glinting in the sun as they moved to secure new frontiers or suppress rebellions. Merchants traveled these roads with fortunes loaded onto wagons, silk from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic. The roads made such trade possible on a scale never before imagined. A Roman citizen could purchase goods that had traveled thousands of miles, items that would have been impossible luxuries in earlier ages. The roads didn't just connect places, they connected worlds, weaving together the diverse cultures of the Mediterranean basin into a single economic and political tapestry. As you walk, you notice how the road adapts to terrain without surrendering its essential character. Where the path climbed steep hills, the engineers carved switchbacks with gentle grades that horses and oxen could manage. Where it crossed marshlands, they raised it on causeways built from millions of tons of stone and earth. Where rivers ran too deep for bridges, they constructed ferries operated by imperial authorities, ensuring that not even water could break the continuity of Roman communication. The maintenance of these roads required constant attention. Teams of road menders, funded by imperial taxes, patrolled every mile, replacing worn stones, clearing debris, and repairing damage from weather and heavy traffic. Local communities were often required to provide labor and materials, making road maintenance a shared responsibility that bound provincial populations to the imperial system. The roads were not just Roman achievements, but collaborative efforts that involved millions of people across the empire. Rest stations appeared at regular intervals, offering shelter, food, and fresh horses to official travelers. These mansiones and mutationes became centers of commerce and information exchange, places where news from distant provinces mingled with local gossip and trade deals were struck over wine and bread. Many grew into towns and cities, their prosperity built upon the foundation of reliable transportation and communication. You pause at what might once have been such a station. The foundation stones remain, outlining rooms where exhausted messengers once slept and merchants negotiated deals that would reshape the ancient economy. The silence now is complete, but you can almost hear the echoes of voices in a dozen languages, the crack of whips as fresh teams were harnessed, the rattle of coins changing hands as the business of empire continued day and night. The strategic importance of these roads cannot be overstated. Military commanders understood that victory belonged to those who could move troops and supplies quickly and reliably. A legion could march 20 miles per day on Roman roads, covering distances that would have taken weeks through trackless wilderness. This mobility allowed relatively small forces to control vast territories, responding to threats and opportunities with speed that enemies found impossible to counter. The roads also served as instruments of cultural transformation. Roman law, language, and customs traveled along them as surely as soldiers and merchants. Provincial populations encountered Roman ways of life through contact with travelers, gradually adopting imperial standards of weights and measures, legal procedures, and architectural styles. The roads were arteries of Romanization, carrying the empire's cultural DNA to every corner of the known world. Yet, the roads were not merely tools of expansion and control. They became symbols of Roman identity itself, embodying the values of order, permanence, and rational planning that the empire claimed as its legacy. To walk a Roman road was to participate in something greater than local custom or tribal tradition. It was to become part of a civilization that measured its greatness not in momentary conquests, but in enduring achievements. As afternoon light begins to slant across the ancient stones, you realize that these roads were more than engineering marvels. They were dreams made manifest, visions of connection and unity carved into the landscape with tools and determination. Every mile represented countless hours of human labor. Every bridge spanning a river marked a victory over natural obstacles that had separated communities for millennia. The Roman road beneath your feet continues into the distance, as straight and purposeful as the day it was completed. Though grass now grows between some stones and centuries of weather have worn the surface smooth, the essential structure remains. These roads were built not just to serve the empire that created them, but to outlast it, carrying their creators' ambitions forward through time like messages written in stone and mortar. Tomorrow, we'll explore how these magnificent arteries carried more than goods and armies. We'll discover the stories of ordinary people whose lives were transformed by the roads, the merchants who built fortunes on reliable transportation, the families separated by distance who could finally exchange letters, and the cultural exchanges that reshaped the ancient world. The roads that began as military necessities became the foundation for a new kind of human civilization, one where distance was measured in days rather than impossibility. You walk deeper into the network, leaving the main thoroughfare for one of the countless secondary roads that branched like veins from the great arteries. These smaller paths tell different stories, quieter tales of daily life in an empire that spanned 3 continents. Here the stones are less perfectly fitted, worn by the passage of local farmers hauling grain to market, pilgrims seeking distant shrines, and families moving between settlements that had grown prosperous in the shadow of Roman order. The engineering changes subtly on these provincial roads. Where the great highways demanded perfection, these paths accepted compromise. They curve around sacred groves that local communities refused to cut down, dip into valleys where bridges would have been too expensive, and sometimes split into parallel tracks where seasonal flooding made single routes unreliable. Yet even these concessions follow Roman principles. The foundation remains solid, the drainage systematic, the mile markers precisely placed. You pause where an ancient milestone leans slightly, its Latin inscription weathered but still readable. The carving speaks of distances to cities whose names have changed or disappeared entirely, reminders that empires rise and fall while roads endure. Children in medieval villages played around these stones, not understanding the language, but recognizing the authority they represented. Generations of travelers used them as landmarks, meeting points, and silent witnesses to journeys that shaped lives and destinies. The roadside reveals layers of human activity stretching across centuries. Broken pottery shards glint in the grass, remnants of meals eaten by travelers who never imagined their discarded dishes would become archaeological treasures. Metal fragments suggest repairs made to wagon wheels and horse harnesses, evidence of the constant maintenance required to keep ancient transportation functioning. These debris fields mark rest stops that existed without official sanction, places where exhausted travelers simply stopped when they could go no further. Water sources determined much of the road's character. Roman engineers understood that humans and animals could travel only so far between reliable springs or rivers. Where natural water was scarce, they sometimes diverted streams or dug wells, creating oases of civilization in otherwise hostile terrain. The remains of these water management systems still dot the landscape, stone-lined channels, and circular wellheads that once meant the difference between life and death for countless travelers. Trade goods moved along these routes in quantities that would astonish ancient peoples from earlier eras. Archaeological excavations reveal the scope of this commerce through scattered artifacts that tell stories of incredible journeys. Chinese silk fragments found in British graves, Indian peppercorns discovered in German settlements, African ivory carved into decorations for Gallic homes. Each object represents not just wealth and craftsmanship, but the human networks that made such exchanges possible across thousands of miles of dangerous terrain. The security of these roads required constant vigilance. Bandits haunted remote sections, preying on merchants and messengers who traveled without adequate protection. Roman authorities responded with patrols, fortified posts, and severe punishments for highway robbery. Yet the threat never entirely disappeared. Local communities sometimes formed their own protective associations, hiring guards or negotiating safe passage agreements with local strongmen who controlled particularly dangerous territories. You climb a hill where the road cuts through solid rock, marveling at the determination required to carve this passage by hand. Tool marks still scar the stone walls, testament to months or years of labor by crews who worked in shifts, breaking granite with fire and water, chisels and hammers. The noise must have echoed for miles, announcing to the surrounding countryside that Rome was reshaping the world according to its will. Local populations would have watched this transformation with mixtures of awe, resentment, and anticipation. Religious significance clung to many roads like incense smoke. Pilgrims followed these paths to distant temples, carrying offerings and prayers across hundreds of miles. Some routes became sacred in themselves, blessed by the footsteps of holy men or marked by miraculous events. Roadside shrines multiplied at crossroads and dangerous passages, places where travelers made offerings for safe journeys or gave thanks for successful arrivals. These small temples and altar stones created a spiritual geography, overlaying the practical network of transportation. The sounds of ancient travel come alive in your imagination as evening approaches. The creak of leather harnesses straining against heavy loads, the rhythmic thud of hobnailed sandals on stone, the jangle of bronze fittings on military equipment. Conversations in a dozen languages would have mixed in the air as Roman citizens, Greek merchants, Germanic tribesmen, and African traders shared the same paths toward different destinations. The roads created a cosmopolitan environment where cultures met and mingled in ways impossible before their construction. Seasonal rhythms shaped road usage in patterns that repeated for centuries. Spring brought the heaviest traffic as winter's isolation ended, and communities rushed to exchange goods accumulated during the cold months. Summer saw military campaigns and long-distance trade expeditions taking advantage of favorable weather. Autumn carried harvest surpluses toward urban markets and winter preparations. Winter itself brought lighter traffic, but never complete abandonment, as imperial business and urgent communications continued regardless of weather. The economic impact of reliable transportation cannot be overstated. Communities that had survived on subsistence agriculture suddenly found markets for specialized products. Villages famous for particular crafts, foods, or raw materials could trade their advantages for goods from distant regions. This specialization increased overall prosperity while creating interdependence that strengthened imperial unity. A Gallic farmer might wear cloth woven in Egypt, while an Egyptian merchant carried tools forged in Spain. You notice how the road adapts to local materials while maintaining Roman standards. In regions rich in limestone, the surface stones gleam white in the fading light. Where volcanic rock was available, the roadway takes on darker hues, but maintains the same careful construction. Local quarries provided materials, local workers provided labor, but Roman engineers provided the knowledge and standards that ensured consistency across thousands of miles. This balance between imperial uniformity and regional resources became a model for effective governance. The diplomatic importance of roads extended far beyond military considerations. Ambassadors from distant kingdoms traveled these routes to negotiate with Roman authorities, their journeys themselves serving as demonstrations of imperial reach and organization. The reliability of Roman transportation made diplomatic communication possible on a scale never before achieved. Treaties negotiated in Rome could be communicated to provincial governors in weeks, enabling coordinated policies across the entire Mediterranean world. Educational opportunities multiplied along the road network. Students could travel from provincial towns to study in Athens, Alexandria, or Rome itself, carrying knowledge back to their home communities. Scholars exchanged ideas across vast distances, creating intellectual networks that transcended political boundaries. Libraries grew in cities connected by reliable transportation, as books and manuscripts could be copied and distributed more efficiently than ever before. The roads also carried less welcome cargo. Diseases spread along trade routes, creating the first truly global pandemics as communities with no previous exposure encountered new pathogens. Invasive species traveled in grain shipments and cargo holds, gradually reshaping ecosystems across the empire. Cultural changes moved just as rapidly, sometimes overwhelming local traditions with imported customs and beliefs. The same network that brought prosperity also brought disruption and loss. As darkness approaches, you realize these stones beneath your feet witness the full spectrum of human experience. Lovers separated by arranged marriages in distant provinces. Their letters carried by imperial messengers who never knew the hopes and heartbreak they transported. Families fleeing war or persecution, their possessions loaded onto carts as they sought safety in unfamiliar territories. Entrepreneurs risking everything on trading ventures that could bring fortune or ruin depending on weather, politics, and luck. The infrastructure supporting road travel created its own economy. Inns and stables, blacksmiths and wheelwrights, guides and translators all built livelihoods around the constant flow of travelers. Some families operated roadside businesses for generations, their prosperity rising and falling with the fortunes of the empire itself. These support networks made long-distance travel feasible for ordinary people, not just wealthy merchants and imperial officials. Military engineering units perfected techniques that would influence construction for millennia. Their methods for surveying straight lines across varied terrain, calculating proper drainage slopes, and organizing massive work crews became standard practices copied by later civilizations. Medieval road builders consulted Roman manuals. Renaissance engineers studied Roman bridges, and modern highway planners still admire the directness and durability of Roman routes. The social hierarchies of travel reflected broader imperial structures. Imperial messengers rode the fastest horses and enjoyed priority at rest stations. Wealthy merchants traveled in comfortable carriages with armed escorts. Ordinary citizens walked or rode in basic carts. Competing for space at crowded inns, slaves carried loads on foot, sleeping in whatever shelter they could find. Yet all shared the same roads, creating temporary communities of travelers who might never meet again, but whose journeys intertwined along these ancient arteries. Ancient arteries. The moon rises over the ancient stones, casting long shadows that transform the roadway into a corridor between worlds. You continue walking, your footsteps joining an endless procession of ghosts who once traveled this same path. In the silvered light, you can almost see them. Roman matrons in covered litters, their curtains drawn against dust and curious eyes. Germanic chieftains riding to negotiate treaties they would later break. Christian pilgrims clutching wooden crosses as they journeyed toward holy sites that promised salvation and miracles. The night air carries phantom sounds across the centuries. The creak of wagon wheels that bore the weight of empires. The shuffle of sandaled feet that carried news faster than armies could march. You pause where the road crests a hill, and in the valley below, imagination peoples the darkness, with torches moving like fallen stars, each flame marking a traveler whose story has been lost to time but whose passage wore these stones smooth. Water management reveals itself more clearly in moonlight, where shadows emphasize the subtle engineering that kept these roads functional across seasons and centuries. Drainage channels carved into bedrock catch your eye, their precise angles calculated to carry away torrential rains that could wash away lesser construction. Culverts built from massive stone blocks still function after 2 millennia, testament to mathematical precision that treated water not as an enemy, but as a force to be channeled and controlled. The Roman genius lay not just in building roads, but in understanding how roads shaped the world around them. Communities that had existed in isolation for generations suddenly found themselves connected to networks of trade, information, and cultural exchange that spanned continents. A potter in rural Gaul could learn techniques developed in Syrian workshops. A farmer in distant Britain could taste wine pressed from grapes that grew on Italian hillsides. The roads dissolved boundaries that geography had maintained since the dawn of human settlement. You descend into a valley where traces of ancient settlements cluster around what was once a major crossroads. Foundation stones emerge from tall grass like broken teeth, marking buildings that housed travelers, stored goods, and facilitated the complex negotiations that kept imperial commerce flowing. Blacksmith shops where broken wagon wheels were repaired, stables where exhausted horses were replaced with fresh teams, taverns where merchants struck deals over cups of watered wine and plates of bread and olives. The legal framework governing road travel was as sophisticated as the engineering that built them. Imperial law specified the rights and obligations of travelers, the responsibilities of innkeepers, the procedures for resolving disputes that arose during journeys. Contracts written on papyrus and wooden tablets governed everything from cargo insurance to the hiring of guides and guards. These documents, discovered in archaeological sites across the former empire, reveal a commercial system of startling complexity and reach. Currency flowed along these routes like blood through arteries, creating the ancient world's first truly international economy. Roman coins discovered in Indian markets, Chinese silk paid for with Mediterranean gold, amber from Baltic shores traded for African ivory in markets that existed because roads made such exchanges possible. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies that traveled these routes created economic integration on a scale not seen again until the modern era. The roads witnessed transformations that reshaped human consciousness itself. Isolated tribes encountered cosmopolitan ideas that challenged ancient traditions. Local deities met foreign gods along roadside shrines where travelers from different cultures shared sacred spaces. Languages mixed and merged as traders developed pidgin dialects that could facilitate commerce across linguistic barriers. The very concept of distance changed as reliable transportation made formerly impossible journeys routine. Military logistics depended absolutely on road networks that could move not just soldiers, but the massive supply trains that kept armies fed, equipped, and operational. A single Roman legion on campaign required tons of grain daily, plus weapons, armor, medical supplies, and siege equipment. The roads made possible a style of warfare based on professional soldiers who could be supported far from their home territories for months or years at a time. You climb another rise where the road cuts through ancient bedrock, and your fingers trace tool marks left by workers whose names history never recorded. These anonymous laborers, many of them slaves or conscripted locals, carved civilization from wilderness with nothing but bronze tools, wooden levers, and human determination. Their work created pathways that would carry emperors and slaves, merchants and missionaries, conquerors and refugees across landscapes that had previously been barriers to human movement. The psychological impact of roads on ancient peoples must have been profound. Horizons that had once marked the limits of the known world suddenly became waypoints on journeys to places that existed only in stories. Young people could leave their birth villages with realistic hopes of seeing wonders their grandparents had never imagined. The roads democratized adventure while creating new forms of homesickness as families scattered across distances that made reunion uncertain. Seasonal migrations followed these routes as surely as bird flights followed ancient pathways through the sky. Craftsmen traveled to markets where their skills commanded premium prices. Agricultural workers moved between regions where different crops ripened at different times. Entertainers followed circuits that brought them to festivals and celebrations across the empire. The roads created a mobile society where talent and ambition could find opportunities regardless of birthplace. Religious movements spread along road networks with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. Mystery cults from the East, philosophical schools from Greece, and eventually Christianity itself traveled these routes, carrying new ideas about divinity, morality, and human purpose. The same infrastructure that moved grain and gold also transported concepts that would reshape Western civilization for millennia to come. The decline of road maintenance marked the beginning of imperial collapse as clearly as any military defeat. When central authority weakened, local communities could no longer afford the constant repairs that kept the network functional. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt. Drainage systems clogged with debris. Bandits multiplied in regions where patrols no longer maintained security. The arteries that had carried imperial lifeblood began to harden and close. Yet even in decay, the roads endured. Medieval travelers followed Roman routes because alternatives simply didn't exist. Renaissance merchants rediscovered ancient bridges and cleared ancient passes. Modern highways often trace paths first surveyed by Roman engineers, who understood that the shortest distance between 2 points might not always be the most practical route through difficult terrain. You reach a section where later civilizations built upon Roman foundations, their different construction techniques layered like geological strata. Medieval cobblestones rest atop Roman polygonal blocks. Renaissance bridge repairs incorporate classical arches. Modern asphalt follows alignments determined by surveyors who worked with bronze instruments and mathematical principles that their successors would not improve upon for centuries. The cultural legacy of Roman roads extends far beyond transportation infrastructure. They established precedents for international law, standardized commerce, and coordinated administration that influenced every subsequent attempt to govern large territories. The concept of reliable public services, maintained by taxation and administered by professional bureaucrats, owes its origins to the systems developed to keep these roads functional across vast distances and diverse populations. As you walk through the night, the ancient stones seem to pulse with accumulated history. Every mile marker witnessed events that shaped the destiny of nations. Every bridge carried refugees fleeing disasters and conquerors pursuing enemies. Every rest station hosted conversations that changed minds, negotiations that prevented wars, and chance encounters that sparked innovations. The roads were more than pathways between destinations. They were theaters where human drama played out on a continental scale. The engineering principles embedded in these roads influenced architecture, urban planning, and civil engineering for centuries after the empire's fall. Roman techniques for laying foundations, calculating load-bearing requirements, and organizing large construction projects became standard practices that spread throughout Europe and beyond. Universities taught Roman methods. Guilds preserved Roman knowledge. Governments consulted Roman precedents when undertaking major infrastructure projects. Dawn approaches, painting the eastern sky with colors that Roman travelers would have recognized. The road continues into the distance, as purposeful and enduring as the day it was completed. Though weeds now grow between some stones and centuries of weather have softened harsh edges, the essential structure remains. These roads were built not just to serve the empire that created them, but to demonstrate that human will, properly organized and persistently applied, could reshape the world itself. Your journey along these ancient arteries has revealed more than engineering achievements or historical facts. You've walked through the dreams and ambitions of a civilization that dared to imagine connections spanning continents, communications crossing cultures, and commerce transcending the barriers that had previously divided humanity into isolated tribes and kingdoms. The roads beneath your feet represent one of history's greatest acts of faith in the future, a commitment to permanence in a world of constant change. Constant change. The first merchants to use these roads understood they were participating in something revolutionary. You pause where archaeologists have uncovered the remains of an ancient warehouse, its foundation stones outlining rooms where goods from across the known world once waited for transport. Amphorae that carried olive oil from Spain, pottery vessels filled with garum from the Black Sea, wooden crates packed with British wool destined for Egyptian looms. The scale of commerce these roads enabled dwarfed anything previously imagined by human civilization. Trading companies emerged that could coordinate activities across thousands of miles. Their success depended on the reliability of Roman transportation networks. Merchant families built fortunes by specializing in particular routes, developing expertise in local customs, languages, and markets that made them indispensable intermediaries between distant regions. Some established trading posts that grew into permanent settlements, their prosperity anchored by the steady flow of traffic along imperial highways. The standardization of currency along these routes created the ancient world's first international monetary system. Roman coins discovered in archaeological sites from Scotland to Sudan demonstrate the reach of this economic integration. Local currencies gradually disappeared as Roman silver and gold became the preferred medium of exchange, not through imperial decree, but through practical necessity. Merchants needed reliable standards of value that would be accepted in markets hundreds of miles from their origins. You follow the road as it curves around a hillside where ancient quarries still bear the scars of Roman stone extraction. Millions of tons of rock were cut from these sites, shaped by skilled craftsmen and transported to construction sites along the expanding network. The organization required for such projects rivals modern industrial operations in complexity and scope. Work crews had to be fed, housed, and paid. Materials had to be surveyed, extracted, and delivered according to precise schedules. Quality control ensured that stones cut in distant quarries would fit perfectly into roadbeds hundreds of miles away. The social mobility these roads created transformed ancient concepts of identity and belonging. A talented individual born in a remote province could travel to Rome itself, acquire education and connections, and return home with skills and knowledge that elevated entire communities. Conversely, Roman citizens could establish themselves in frontier territories, bringing imperial customs and technologies to regions that had never known such sophistication. The roads created a meritocracy where ability and ambition mattered more than birthplace or ancestry. Legal systems evolved to accommodate the complexity of trans-regional commerce and travel. Courts developed procedures for resolving disputes between parties from different provinces operating under different local customs. Contract law became increasingly sophisticated as merchants needed reliable frameworks for agreements that might take months or years to fulfill across vast distances. The concept of international law itself emerged from the practical necessity of governing activities that transcended traditional, tribal, and regional boundaries. Communication systems that utilize these roads revolutionized governance and administration. The cursus publicus, Rome's state postal service, could deliver messages from Britain to Syria in weeks rather than months. This speed of communication allowed central authorities to coordinate policies across the entire empire, responding to threats and opportunities with unprecedented efficiency. Provincial governors could consult with imperial advisors on complex issues. Military commanders could request reinforcements or supplies with reasonable confidence they would arrive in time to be useful. You descend into a valley where the road crosses a stream on a bridge that has carried traffic for 2,000 years. The stonework remains solid, its arches perfectly proportioned to distribute weight, while allowing floodwaters to pass beneath without creating dangerous backflows. Roman engineers understood hydraulics with a sophistication that would not be matched again until the Renaissance. Their bridges didn't just span obstacles. They worked with natural forces to create structures that became stronger over time as water flow compressed their foundations. The cultural exchanges facilitated by these roads created new forms of art, literature, and philosophy that blended traditions from across the Mediterranean world. Greek philosophical schools established branches in Gallic cities. Egyptian religious mysteries attracted devotees in Germanic provinces. African musical traditions influenced performances in Italian theaters. The roads didn't just move people and goods, they moved ideas, creating a cosmopolitan culture that transcended regional boundaries. Urban planning throughout the empire reflected principles developed through road construction experience. Cities were laid out with the same mathematical precision that guided highway surveys. Street grids followed Roman standards that optimized traffic flow and defensive capabilities. Public buildings were positioned to serve populations that included not just local residents, but travelers passing through on imperial business. The roads taught Roman planners to think on continental scales while attending to local details. Agricultural production was revolutionized by reliable access to distant markets. Farmers could specialize in crops best suited to their local climate and soil conditions, confident that surplus production could be transported profitably to regions where such goods commanded premium prices. Wine production expanded dramatically in areas with suitable growing conditions because roads made it economically feasible to ship heavy amphorae across hundreds of miles. Olive oil, grain, and preserved foods moved in quantities that supported population growth throughout the empire. The roads witnessed migrations that reshaped the demographic composition of entire regions. Veterans discharged from military service often settled along routes they had helped build or defend, establishing communities that maintained Roman customs in frontier territories. Craftsmen followed opportunities to regions where their skills were in high demand. Displaced populations fleeing natural disasters or political upheavals could relocate to areas where their labor was needed, creating a mobility that prevented localized catastrophes from becoming empire-wide crises. You climb toward a mountain pass where the road zigzags up steep slopes with grades calculated to accommodate heavily loaded ox carts. The engineering required to maintain consistent gradients through such terrain demonstrates Roman determination to let nothing compromise the efficiency of their transportation network. Where other civilizations might have accepted seasonal limitations or detours around difficult terrain, Roman engineers carved paths that remained passable year-round. Their surveying techniques for maintaining proper angles across varied topography would not be improved upon for more than a millennium. Religious pilgrimage took on new dimensions as roads made distant shrines accessible to ordinary believers. Sacred sites that had previously served only local populations began attracting visitors from across the empire. This religious tourism created economic opportunities for communities along pilgrimage routes while spreading religious practices and beliefs far from their points of origin. The roads democratized access to the divine, allowing personal faith to transcend the geographical limitations that had previously confined most people to local traditions. The diplomatic implications of road networks extended far beyond the empire's borders. Foreign ambassadors traveling to Rome could observe firsthand the organizational capabilities and resource mobilization that supported imperial power. The roads themselves became diplomatic statements, demonstrations of Roman engineering prowess that impressed potential allies and intimidated potential enemies. Barbarian chieftains who negotiated treaties while traveling on Roman roads could hardly fail to appreciate the logistical advantages that supported Roman military dominance. Educational opportunities multiplied as schools and libraries in major cities became accessible to students from distant provinces. The transmission of knowledge accelerated as scholars could travel between centers of learning, sharing research, and engaging in debates that advanced human understanding across multiple fields. Medical knowledge, mathematical techniques, and technological innovations spread along road networks with a speed that created the ancient world's first information revolution. You notice how the roadside vegetation has adapted to centuries of disturbance from construction and traffic. Certain plant species that thrive in disturbed soil have followed Roman routes across continents, creating botanical corridors that modern ecologists still study. Some of these plants have medicinal properties that were deliberately cultivated by road maintenance crews, who understood that travelers frequently needed treatment for injuries and illnesses encountered during long journeys. The economic theories that emerged from road-based commerce influenced political philosophy and administrative practice throughout the empire. Concepts of supply and demand, currency exchange, and market regulation developed through practical experience with trans-regional trade. These ideas shaped imperial tax policies, urban planning decisions, and diplomatic strategies that recognized economic interdependence as a source of political stability. Military strategy evolved to take full advantage of road network capabilities. Armies could be concentrated quickly to meet specific threats, then dispersed to defensive positions once immediate dangers were resolved. This flexibility allowed relatively small numbers of professional soldiers to control vast territories by maintaining the initiative in conflicts with less mobile enemies. The roads created a strategic depth that made it nearly impossible for external enemies to achieve decisive victories against Roman forces. As you continue walking, you realize these stones beneath your feet represent more than engineering achievements or historical artifacts. They embody a vision of human potential that dared to imagine a world where distance was measured in days rather than in possibility, where cultural barriers could be crossed as easily as geographical ones, and where the accumulated knowledge and achievements of diverse civilizations could be shared for the benefit of all humanity. The road ahead disappears into morning mist, but its direction remains clear and purposeful. These ancient arteries continue to pulse with life, carrying modern traffic along routes first surveyed by Roman engineers who understood that the true measure of civilization lies not in monuments to individual glory, but in infrastructure that serves the common good across generations. Their legacy endures not in marble statues that proclaim imperial vanity, but in pathways that still connect communities and cultures across the landscapes they transformed forever. The ancient stones grow quiet beneath your feet as dawn breaks fully over the landscape. Your journey along these remarkable arteries has revealed more than the technical mastery of Roman engineers or the scope of imperial ambition. You have walked through humanity's first great experiment in global connection, witnessing how vision and determination could reshape not just geography, but the very possibilities of human civilization. These roads endured because they served something larger than conquest or commerce. They embodied an understanding that isolation breeds stagnation, while connection creates opportunity. Every mile of perfectly fitted stone represented a choice to invest in permanence over expediency, to build for centuries rather than decades, to create infrastructure that would outlast the empire that conceived it. As you take your final steps along this ancient pathway, remember that the same human needs that drove Roman road builders still shape our world today. The desire to connect, to trade, to share knowledge, to move freely across distances that once seemed impossible. The methods have changed, but the fundamental vision remains unchanged. We are still building roads, still seeking to bind distant places with reliable pathways, still believing that connection creates strength. The Roman roads beneath your feet whisper a simple truth across the centuries. Great civilizations are measured not by their monuments to power, but by the bridges they build between human hearts and minds. These stones will outlast us all, carrying forward the dreams of those who dared to imagine a connected world.